Good evening, and welcome to Bredon Messianic Synagogue's Tuesday evening study. We're going to begin with prayer like we always do, and I want to remind everybody that we have a long list of people that are in need of prayer, but some that are brought to the forefront right now. Barbara S's husband had surgery today, and her brother-in-law is not doing well and in hospice, as well as James Tom, is in hospice now, and the doctor said unless without intervention of a supernatural miracle, there's only days with him. So please be praying for Barbara, for her family, for Jane and her family, as well as for Robin and Fred and Jerry and Jerry and Jerry and Sandy, and for Raphael and for Jeremy and for Timothy and for Jim, and we just have a long list of people in our community that just need a supernatural touch from the Lord. So please be praying for all of those needs and people, as well as for Miss Cleo's family. Miss Cleo passed away on Friday, and the funeral, or the memorial rather, for her will be next Thursday, not Thursday a couple days from now, but a week from, here at the synagogue at 2 o'clock. So we have to do funerals. We'll figure out how to do it. We'll figure it out. It'll work out. The Lord knows what's going on, and we can take care of that. So, but just know for those watching. Also, if you're watching, you can go to our website, shalompensacola.com, and follow previous teachings, as well as our Shabbat services, a lot of teaching and events going on, as well as if you want to support our congregation, there's a donation link there. We're excited about our VTS, which is coming up this coming week, and we have a whole bunch of children. It was amazing. Last week we were like at just a few, and suddenly poof, we had, because we are part of a procrastination, a whole nation of procrastinators. And so we're glad that everybody has signed up now, and we have a good group of young people that are going to hear about the Lord. And hopefully those that are not yet believers in Yeshua will become believers in Yeshua before the end of the week. Those that are believers in Yeshua will be strengthened in their faith and encouraged to reach out and affect their world for the Messiah. I'm trying to think if there's any other announcements that we have to make. I do not think there are any other than men's prayer meeting tomorrow morning at 7:30 here at the synagogue for those that can be here. And then, of course, Wednesday evening at 5:30 and Thursday evening at 5:30. Wednesday is Torah study at Drowsy Poet on Brent Lane, and Thursday will be Torah study at the Drowsy Poet on Woodbine. So the opportunities for you, these are not times where I teach. It's times where each person studies the Torah Parsha for the upcoming Shabbat. They pray, they seek the Lord, that he would open up a nugget or some kind of a meaningful verse or understanding of a verse that they want to share with the group. So it's an opportunity for everybody to share together at the studies. So that's the announcement for coming up. Mary Grace? There is the Farmers Market and Craft Fair this Sunday from 10 o'clock until 2 o'clock here at the synagogue. And I want to encourage you, if you're one of those people that makes crafts, or you have a farm, or you sell products like oils or pickles or something, this is an opportunity for you to sell your products, and that way we can bless you by hosting it, and you can bless the community and be blessed through it. So yes, the farmers market is this Sunday. So Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we thank you so much for your presence. And Abba, in this world that seems like it's in turmoil at times, we know that you are in absolute control, that nothing going on right now is a surprise to you. Nothing has ever occurred to you things are in your plan and you are involved actively. And we just ask that you would help us to be part of what's going on for your kingdom. Father, that we would pray, we would fast, we would study, we would seek you, but more than that, even we would share the good news with those around us. Father, we believe in your supernatural power, not only to heal, but healing is temporary. Father, redemption, salvation is eternal, and that's where our focus is. And so we thank you that you do heal and you do touch and you do bless and you do provide. But ultimately, this world and this life is just a vapor compared to the eternal. So, Father, help us to help others to get ready to spend eternity with you. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu. Amen. Now I'm going to invite Lincoln up, who is going to be our teacher for this evening. And he's continuing a series that he began last time he taught. Yes? This is the third installment. So here we go.
This is God's Divine Plan for Marriage, Part 3, Betrothal Rituals, or Divine Courtship. My wife and I were never engaged. I showed up at her house when she was my girlfriend of 4.5 months, and I married her right then and there. Much like my rabbi's 1-date, 10-day courtship, that doesn't quite tell you the rest of the story. My wife and I spent a year talking and getting to know each other, and even with that, the trunk of her car is probably the only reason we ever got married, if you look at things from a perspective of purely physical causes and effects. In reality, we were brought together by God for some meaning in His divine plan. And we never got engaged because betrothal, not engagement, is the pattern displayed in the Scriptures as the model of His love relationship with us. So this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about betrothal rituals and share the testimony of how my marriage started in my mother-in-law's living room, not in a church or synagogue ceremony. Firstly, I think that prayer is vitally important. I prayed for my wife for 10 years before I met her. I didn't know her name or anything about her, but I prayed for her protection, her peace, and her walk with God. Secondly, you need to understand that betrothal is not engagement. It is not a formal variant of engagement. It was not thought of in the same way as engagement until the Dark Ages. Rather, betrothal is a covenant promise binding a couple in marriage and culminating in a wedding. But as the gospel accounts show us, a betrothed couple is already married and requires a divorce to separate. If you consider the wording of the passage in Matthew that talks about this, you'll see the use of the term that Joseph was considering putting Mary away privately. You don't put people away like socks you're no longer using. The term is used of people solely to indicate divorce. Thirdly, just as Yeshua didn't show up one Pesach and pop the question to his disciples about the renewed covenant, but he got to know the disciples for 3 years, so also I entered my betrothal after over a year of talking and getting to know my wife. I did a lot of things wrong. Some of those things messed up the picture of betrothal for my family and friends. I want to own up to that as I share the history of my marriage and my plan, what I did right and what I did wrong. My courtship of my wife started with a miracle. We both broke our personal rules to seize an opportunity from God. And that's a good thing to do, to break your personal rules to follow God's leading. We were both on a dating site called OkCupid, and if you have a cup of tea with me, I will be glad to tell you all about why I love the model that this site uses. My wife had a rule that she wouldn't contact men. She would only respond to their messages. I had a rule that I would consider matches only if they lived within a 4-hour drive of my house, because my mother was older and might suddenly need care. I lived on the Emerald Coast of Florida. She lived in southern Nevada. This was an impossible match. But God. This woman who would become my wife saw my profile and decided she had to break her rule once and send the first message. After that, it would be up to this unbelievable guy to take the lead. And this man that I was saw this tentative and vulnerable message and decided to break his rule and respond positively to a woman outside his area. This began a period of essentially letter writing, to put it in traditional terms, though really more like a messenger chats to be more relatable to current paradigms. Actually, a little of both. I checked my messages, and if she wasn't online, I answered our increasingly interleaved and splintered email tome. If she was around, we would have something more like a messenger chat. We discussed match questions where we disagreed. We discussed our favorite music, movies, books, and things to do. We talked about our daily activities and current events. We learned a lot about each other. After 4 or 5 months, I realized that she might be my future wife. I decided to visit her, and I started making plans. Okay, I was actually pretty confident I'd found her, but I was cautious about that conclusion. And at this point, I made one of the 2 big mistakes of our courtship. Somewhat understandable, since my knowledge of the biblical picture was not then what it is today. But a mistake that gave opportunity for the picture I was painting with our courtship to be misunderstood by her family. But before I tell you about that, I need to explain how a broken lock made our marriage possible. How could a broken lock improve your relationship? I got off the plane and found my luggage. The woman I was meeting, remember, we're not a couple of any kind at this point, and she'd just given me her phone number the day before so I could keep her posted about my flight. She didn't park and meet me at the gate because airport parking prices are a bit ridiculous. So I texted her and met her in the very short-term parking lot. A quick hug, throw my luggage in the trunk, and get on the road because the first 15 minutes was free, or at least reasonable. We talked as she drove me to the hotel I had booked. It's a bit far from her house, but it's a charming place once you get to the front desk area. We got out of the car and went to the trunk, but when she put the key in, nothing happened. I tried it, she tried it, and I tried it again. At this point, I was pretty hungry, so I suggested dinner. We went into the hotel. Most hotels in her town have restaurants inside, and enjoyed a lovely dinner together. After dinner, we returned to the car and called her roadside assistance service, and they were completely useless. Unless there was medication or a child locked in the car, they wouldn't come out for at least 5 hours. At this point, I was pretty frustrated. All my luggage, including the carry-on in which I'd packed the smart things like a change of clothes and my toothbrush, were in this stupid trunk. But I didn't fume and fuss because that just wouldn't be helpful. Little did I know that my future wife was being very impressed, in spite of her embarrassment, by how calm and reasonable I was being. I have to admit that it was more fatalism on my part than maturity. After all, there was nothing I could do about the situation, and getting angry wouldn't improve it. But I was also trusting God. I knew it would be okay. There wasn't anything in there I had to have right away. We said goodnight, and I went to my room. But she called me in a few minutes to say she was across the street getting me a pair of pants and a shirt, along with a few necessities. The next day, on her lunch hour, she kept working all the time I was visiting, she took her car to get the trunk fixed, and she dropped my luggage at the hotel before going back to work. If we hadn't had this situation, she wouldn't have been impressed by my grace and patience. And if she hadn't been impressed with my gracious patience, she wouldn't have trusted me enough to become my girlfriend at the end of this trip. And if she hadn't become my girlfriend then, we wouldn't have been in a place to get married by November. And if we hadn't married in November, she wouldn't have been my wife when my mother died. And in that case, I would probably have put the relationship on hold to deal with the estate and grieving process. And being on hold, we likely would have drifted apart before I was ready to pick it up again, if I'd even survived the event, because I barely survived it with her constant support and nutritional guidance. That broken lock saved my marriage and my life. But getting back to that day, after work, she returned to the hotel, and we sat in the atrium and talked, planned a few outings, and had dinner together before she went home. The next day, after work, we went to a few of the local points of interest, ate together, and went to our separate places of rest. On the third day, we arranged to meet to visit her best friend. Before we went to that, I met her in the atrium of my hotel and asked her, by the beautiful waterfall, if I could call her my girlfriend. She didn't answer me then, and we went to meet her best friend. Her friend berated us for one of those two big mistakes I mentioned. While I had made every effort to be in public only, and while we behaved ourselves completely, our first kiss was 2 months later. I hadn't arranged for a chaperone to be present with us on this visit. I believe strongly that chaperones are important, and if I'd arranged for one on this trip, our relationship might have been better understood by my wife's family. I regret not having this safeguard in place. God preserved our purity, but our reputation suffered some. I think there are members of her family who think to this day that we were putting on airs in public, but being naughty in private. And because that's not true, it would have been simple to prevent that idea from ever being plausible. Before I got on the plane the next morning, She said yes to being my girlfriend, and I told her for the first time that I loved her. Over the next few months, we talked on the phone and made plans, visited each other for my mom's friends to give their approval of her, and for Sukkot when her family got to give their approval of me. And I gathered gifts and wrote a ketubah. What's a ketubah? I hear you cry. Well, maybe not the people in this room, but for the benefit of those online, and for those of you in this room who might be wondering, a ketubah is a document of Jewish origin detailing the marriage contract, specifically the rights and responsibilities of the groom in relation to the bride. And at this point in the narrative, I was invited to Thanksgiving with her family. Her family had no idea that when we sat down for Thanksgiving dinner, it would be with a new son-in-law. And that's partly my fault. But enough about that. You came to hear about betrothal. So on Tuesday, November 22nd, 2016, I asked my girlfriend, who knew that this was going to happen on this trip, but not which day. See, we had a signal that we had arranged. When I showed up at her house wearing this shirt, she would know that I was about to pop the question. I showed up in this shirt and she was like, "What, now? No, are you kidding? No. Oh my gosh, I'm not ready." So I asked her to get ready and bring down the items I had sent ahead to save baggage space. I read my prepared speech and the ketubah I'd prepared. I presented the gifts and explained each one. And then I poured wine into my girlfriend's cup. I did all of this in honor of the pattern shown in Scripture of the betrothal. The groom would meet with the bride's parents, explain how he would care for her, present gifts as token of his future care, seek their approval, and then, if they agreed and the bride was of age to decide, put the offer before her. This meeting to arrange the marriage is mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 24, when Abraham's servant negotiated for Rivkah, and in Judges 14, when Samson asked his father to get a certain woman for him. I put this cup of wine before my girlfriend and asked her to marry me. When she lifted that cup to her lips, we became husband and wife. I wish that I had made all of that clear to her family beforehand. I'm afraid that because I did not, I marred this beautiful picture for them. We were married but apart, joined in matrimony but not wed, not able until the wedding to become one. This is the same state in which Mary and Joseph were when Mary was visited by Gabriel and became pregnant by the Ruach HaKodesh. Now the birth of Yeshua, the Messiah, happened this way. When his mother Miriam was engaged to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Ruach HaKodesh. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her publicly, made up his mind to dismiss her secretly. But while he considered these things, behold, an angel of Adonai appeared to him in a dream, saying, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Miriam as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Ruach HaKodesh. She will give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins." That's Matthew 1, verses 18 through 21 in the TLV. Now, I'm disappointed that the TLV chose to use engaged instead of betrothed here, because they're not the same. Joseph couldn't just walk away. he would have had to give Mary a get and pay the forfeiture to prevent making a public example of her. Today's engagements are not like this. You can just walk away and no formal decrees are needed. That's part of why my wife and I were never engaged. This is also, by the way, the state that we are in as the body of Messiah at this time. We are betrothed to our Savior, and we are awaiting his return for the wedding celebration. If you are contemplating marriage and wish to have a betrothal, what do you need to do? First, make sure you're sure. Betrothal is not another word for engagement. When you are betrothed, you're married. Second, prepare a ketubah. The ketubah is a major facet of the marriage in biblical culture. It's what makes a wife and spells out her rights in the marriage. It commonly includes information about the bride price, the manner in which the husband will care for her, and the valuation the husband must forfeit to sever his ties with her, along with legal record of the date and validity of their marriage. This function of validation is considered by many today to be filled by a marriage license. But that pattern places the marriage solely under the authority of the government, which does not always value the covenant of marriage. So I think the ketubah is very important to basing the marriage in faith and in Adonai's authority. Third, gather together gifts for her and or her family. Fourth, meet with her family and agree on the way you will care for her, or have him meet with your family and explain how he will care for you. Discussing this beforehand, the formal meeting, may be very helpful in preparing the ketubah. Have any legal paperwork ready at this point so you don't have to go through an extra formality that will muddy the waters for your kinfolk. Finally, make your offer and rejoice when she accepts. After the betrothal comes the period of anticipation. Prepare a place for the bride, make a chuppah, invite your friends and family to the celebration, and go get the bride for the wedding. Are there any questions? All right. I guess so. Yes.
Did you write the ketubah in English and Hebrew, or just English?
Just English. I did not know really any Hebrew at this time.
Did you make it just like a document like that, or is it something you framed?
Yes, it is.
Hold on. The question for those listening online, well, the first question was, did you write the ketubah you wrote in Hebrew and English, and you said just English? The second one was,
Was it just like a paper like that, or was it framed?
was it just a simple piece of paper, or did you make a actual fancy certificate?
I printed out with a very nice font my ketubah on a regular piece of paper, but it is framed in our house.
So you went all the way to the 11 by 8.5 by 11, did you?
I did. Of course, I didn't have to make space for the Hebrew on mine, so that I made it a little smaller.
Yes.
How much time was in between the agreement and then finally the wedding?
That's
Not.
another story.
Yes, that is another story. Not as much time as I had hoped. Because of the way events unfolded with my mother's death and the things that were happening, we had our wedding on January 1st of the following year.
So that was from November to January.
November to
then.
January.
Okay.
Just a few months.
Any other questions? Yes, Mary Grace.
Does it work the same for marriages between older people?
Yes. Marriage is marriage is marriage. It should work the same between, and that's, by the way, all of those guidelines are healthy as far as making sure you're not alone with somebody or in a compromised situation where somebody could accuse you or let your good be evil spoken of. All of those things, no matter how old you are, if it's if you were married and your spouse passed away and then you got married again and that spouse passed away and now you're 70 and you're getting married again, the same process for reputation and such is encouraged. Yes.
Obviously, you delved into different approaches to marriage, courting, engagement, and all those things. Are there any different approaches that you would make note of that stand out as, maybe more orthodox approaches to marriage, but ones that you didn't necessarily agree with for your own reasons?
The question is, are there any other forms of process approaching marriage that I considered or that I would take note of? And my answer is no, not really. The pattern that is shown us in the Bible is
Actually,
a very good
there's
pattern.
one that's actually in the Bible that we don't do today, and that is the arranged marriage. The example that you used right at the very beginning, where Abraham sent his servant to go get a bride for Isaac. The bride and groom didn't even meet until they were entering the tent to be married. So there is a third viable solution that's not often done today, and that is an arranged marriage where the parents actually set up the whole marriage and the young couple or old couple or whatever get married based upon trusting the parents to make God-led decisions in that matter.
Yes, actually, and that's actually something that I did consider and was kind of in process when I met my wife. Was that my mother and her friends were starting to look around for likely candidates on my behalf, but I found her myself. For
Yes.
that.
Then you have Ruth and Boaz, which would help to answer Mary Grace's question.
Right. Now, the Ruth and Boaz situation is a whole separate thing, and that has to do with a near kinsman and the responsibility. Because Ruth didn't have any children, it was the responsibility of her near kinsman to fulfill Torah, to marry her, so that the name would not die out in that generation. So that's a fourth, but that's not something that is generally done today. Again, it's something that is done in some situations in the very ultra-Orthodox community, but it's not generally done today. Where, if a husband dies, the brother marries the woman so that they can bring forth children. You had another question?
No, it's not relevant.
Okay, so those are different things, but for our sense of what we have today, for instance, in biblical times, in order to separate once betrothed, there's actually the putting away or the giving of a get or the separation, all that. We don't have a mechanism for that in our culture. In other words, now we only have divorce if you're already married. That's something that would be done separate in a religious kind of a way rather than a legal kind of way, in the way that a divorce would be in our society now. But that is something that needs to be taken into account, because in our society we have got to where we tend to date progressively until we either just give up and take the person that's last on the list. I'm tired of dating, I'm just going to get married. I'm settling for whatever. Or we end up damaging ourselves so much through the process that we lose our value and then settle because we don't think we deserve anything better at that point. And those are both really dangerous ways to do things. And one of the advantages to a betrothal slash chaperoned courtship is that preservation. And one of the advantages of actually having parents involved in it is often our parents can see things that we don't see because we're blinded by our desire instead of seeing the truth. And, you know, the saying love is blind is a real thing that we need to be aware of and concerned of. And if you don't have parents, close friends, rabbis, people like that are very helpful in being that buffer to help make those decisions. Yes.
On that note, would you say that when one young person is pursuing another, that talking to their, their spiritual head, more or less, and the person who is somehow responsible for them spiritually, is going to be what gives them the proper insight into that relationship?
So let me repeat the question to as much as I can. Aaron asked, when a young person is interested in another person, is it good or valuable or an asset to go to the spiritual leader of that person? I can tell you that with the people that I've interacted with that had good, solid relationships and marriages, one of the first things involved is contacting the leader of that. For instance, and recently, I did that with one of our two of our young ladies in our congregation that are entering that kind of phase of a relationship, where I contacted their rabbi and said, hey, what's this person like? Before I let this person, or encourage, I say let, I really don't have the ability, I don't have a leash where I'm, or a key to a door or anything, but before I encourage this person to engage in this relationship or open that door, is this somebody that you would let your daughter marry? If that question can't be answered yes, then it's a stay away. You encourage the person to look elsewhere. And then there's other aspects. For instance, I personally believe that you shouldn't even enter into that kind of a search until you're prepared for marriage. And I'm not talking about just old enough, or physically able to, but I'm talking about have your finances in order, have a plan for your life in order, have a place to live in order, have a vehicle that you can drive, have, all of those things in place before you, because if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of somebody else. And so you should have, and biblically and traditionally, a young married couple, the man wouldn't work for the first year. So he had enough money, well, not because he was unemployable, but I'm sorry, but that, he would make sure that he had enough money in the bank and everything so that they could spend that first year building relationship with each other instead of worrying about how the bills are going to be paid and all of those kind of things. Imagine how few divorces we would have in our society if you took all of the financial pressures out of the first year of the marriage, and they were able to just spend time building a relationship together, getting to know each other, dealing with all of that stuff without all the external strife and strain. So those are things I think that, and I say I think because I didn't do this. I know that Pammy and I spent 10 years just getting to the place we would have been if we'd have waited 1 year to get married and actually prepared things, to get a home, to get all those things together. And we went through a lot of struggle, not with each other, but just struggles, because we've never really had any kind of battles between us that were like that. But we did deal with a lot of issues that we wouldn't have had to deal with if I'd have had money in the bank, all those things taken care of like I think should be. Yes, Catherine.
So would you say that
I wasn't telling you to sit down. I just didn't want to kick your water bottle over.
How doable is that really in our society today? Because there's so many other factors at play in.
It is doable. It's just not done. Let me put that in different terms. So you know, is it advisable? Yes. Is it encouraged? Yes. Is it doable? Yes. The problem is that our society pushes us into things that we shouldn't do, and we do it because that's the expectation of our society. In other words, in the 1950s and early 60s, and even in the beginning of the 70s, when a couple got married, they moved in with their parents and they lived there for 5 or 6 or 7 years while they saved up the money so they could pay cash for a house and move into a house. We don't do that anymore because our society says when you get out of high school, you should go get your own apartment or your own house. And so we've changed dramatically in the expectations so that by the time a young person gets to be 25 or 26, they now have home debt, a new car debt, all kinds of college debt, and all those things that weren't in the 50s because we saved up money to buy cash for a car, so we didn't have car debt. We didn't expect to get a brand new car. Nobody even considered the option of getting a new car. They got whatever they could so that they'd have it. They would save money for a house, and because they didn't borrow money from the bank, houses back then cost $10,000 that now cost $100,000 or $200,000, because once you start financing, they can raise the price of everything. Same way with school. School used to cost $2,000 or $3,000 a year to go to college. Now it costs $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $100,000 because people are taking loans out to do it, and banks are super happy to loan lots of money, and things get more expensive once things become financed.
I remember my mom frequently told me that my books for 1 year cost as much as a whole year of college for her, including room, board, books, tuition, everything.
So we've allowed culture to change what we do. The only way to fix that is to not bend to culture. So having completed college or have a job skill or that in place, some money in the bank, at least a vehicle that you either own or can afford, those kind of things, insurance for health, things like that in place. I'm not saying you have to have a year's worth of money in the bank. I'm saying you have to be prepared for some kind of downturn or things so that you don't blow up your relationship. Aaron, and then back to you. Yes.
So in the marriages that you've overseen and conducted, what's been the norm in that regard? Has it been more people not being prepared in that way or being prepared?
About half and half. The wise ones got married with some preparation. So that's that. And I encourage people to do that and count the cost. The scripture says count the cost before you do things. A wise man plans and prepares before he builds, all those things. So it's important. Now, how much money in the bank and all that, that's kind of like how long is long in hair. It depends on the person. It depends. Because somebody, for instance, who doesn't have any desire to have a $300,000 house or a brand new car or whatever, they only need a little bit of money in the bank. But somebody who their life and what they want is more, then they have to prepare for more. And that's stuff that should be all communicated between the guy and the girl before it gets to that point. Yes.
So, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying before. All of those things that, the man is supposed to get prepared with, before even considering the relationship.
Yes.
What do you tell someone who is already in one but doesn't have all of that right yet?
In a relationship?
Yeah.
Then before you make the next step, make sure you have that stuff organized.
But there's no condemnation from
No. I don't believe in condemnation at all. I believe in education. Okay. There's a difference between condemnation and conviction. Conviction lifts up, condemnation pushes down. So you take somebody from where they are and you say, look, this is where you are. This is where I think you should be for the next step. How do we get you to that place? And encourage them to do that. So yeah, those are things that are important. And you know, we can't undo the past, but we can build for a wise future. And all that's, like I said, in discussion. If somebody wants to live in a travel trailer, they have to have lots less preparation. There's nothing wrong with living in a travel trailer. People I know that spent their whole life living in travel trailers and love it because they can get up and move anytime they want to. So that's not a negative thing. I'm just saying it costs less to buy a travel trailer than it does to buy a house. Yes.
So I know some people, some men have debilitating conditions, and it's difficult for them to obtain all those and make all those preparations.
To what? Do what?
For them to obtain all of those different preparatory goals. What would you say about those circumstances?
I think that I don't think that the preparation changes for the outcome. If you want to have the right outcome, you have to have the right end go. And now I will say that twice now we've said the man, but biblically it wasn't just the man. If you read Proverbs 31, the woman worked, the woman made clothes, the woman sold property, the woman did things.
After marriage.
Huh?
After she was already
Right. So, but even before that, there was involvement. The woman was involved in this. So we've got this mindset. So what I'm saying is, if for instance, I'm not talking about you. But if, for instance, somebody falls in love with a woman who's affluent, then it changes the narrative of what has to happen for them to be in that position. If you marry a woman who owns a hotel chain, then your preparation requirement dramatically decreases because her preparation requirement dramatically increased. So in the scheme of things the way they are, it's both parties. So for instance, if for instance the woman is older, and I'm not using you as an example, but the woman is older, so she's already out of college and she's working, and he's in college but going to be working, then there's preparation. What do we have to do so that we get to the place where this makes sense and we can financially do this? So she may have a job as an attorney or as a lawyer or as an accountant or something where she can carry him going to school and doing that. So in that case, he wouldn't have to finish school and have everything in place because he's got her in a position to carry part of the load and all that. So it depends on the two parties, not just one party. But either way, no matter whether it's one party, two party, if it was all the girl or all the guy or both of them together, the goals should be similar. We want to have a place to live, whatever that is. Some people want to live in a hole in the ground. And I'm serious. There's people out west, they dig a hole in the side of a mountain, build a little house in there, and that's where they live. If that's what the couple wants, then that's their goal, and whatever it takes to be prepared to do that. If they have loftier goals or different goals, then they have to be prepared to go in that direction. But debt kills marriages. Most marriages don't break up because of adultery. They break up because of finances. And both are unfaithfulness. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
So, Lincoln, you emphasize chaperones, obviously a number of times in your own life. You said you look back and it was really important, to have a chaperone in the picture. There were times that there wasn't one, and that had detrimental effects. I mean, just how important is that? Because obviously there's a lot of young people watching this, and some of us here who ask the question, just how important is that? I mean, we can do things like checking in with people who know what we're doing. We can do things like having a third person there, maybe a friend or somebody else, but that's not necessarily a chaperone. So what's the difference there?
Okay, so there are two questions. The first was how important is it with checking in and other ways that people can keep track of what you're doing to have a chaperone? Is that correct?
Yeah.
How
And
important you think having a
how
chaperone
important do
is?
I think having a chaperone is? And the second question was...
As opposed to alternative
Right,
ways
right.
of monitoring or observance of what's going on.
Right. And the second question was...
That was all the questions.
Oh, that was the whole question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's very important, and there really is no substitute, because the enemy does not have to prove that you have been unfaithful to the principles that you espouse. He just has to cast doubt. It's been that way since the very beginning. The first thing that we have recorded that the enemy does is question, cast doubt on what God said. Has God really said that you can't eat of all these trees? And the enemy will use things that are very close to the truth, because that makes the lie more believable. And it's all well and good to have somebody check in on you and ask you what's going on, but you don't have a witness if you don't have a chaperone.
Okay. Two things real quick. One is, wasn't could you not eat from all the trees, it was you shall not surely die, was the lie. But number two, and I want to make this clear, I think there's a difference between best practice and what we can point to in the scripture and say, thus saith the Lord. I think chaperoning is best practice. I think accountability is best practice. But we can't find a verse in the Bible that gives us an example of chaperoning. And matter of fact, when we talk about the Ruth thing, there was no chaperone with Ruth. Naomi said, go to work, go and lie down with Boaz, go and do this, go and do that. So I just want to be clear, best practice is not because you might do something wrong. Best practice is so that your reputation is preserved and in case of the other. But it's about reputation more than anything else, but it's best practice. And so about going back to the condemnation thing, if somebody chooses to have chaperones, then I think that's the best practice. If they don't choose to have chaperones, I'm not going to condemn them, because I can't point to a scripture in the Bible that says, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt have chaperones. But there is a leeway for the enemy to make accusations, to do things when we don't do that. So those are important differentials. Yes?
So I'm going to go ahead and follow up that question with your answer with a little bit of a fireball of controversy here. Ruth and Boaz, whenever they met that evening and they had that conversation at his threshing floor, what happened exactly
What do you mean what happened?
between them?
They had a conversation.
Okay. I mean, there's been different...
Are you talking about, she laid by his feet? It was just letting him know she was available, but it didn't mean that anything happened beyond that. If it did, it would have said, and they knew each other, which is the biblical for, and they had sex. So that's a separate thing. So the text does not put that in there, and anybody who wants to throw that in there is adding something that's not in the text, and there's no reason to believe that anything ungodly happened. As a matter of fact, Naomi tells her, go do this so that he'll know that you're available. And then the next thing we have is him following the Torah on what to do to bring that relationship to fullness. So here's how you do it. You glean in the corners, that's following Torah. You do this, that's following Torah. Boaz says, drop the extra stuff, that's following Torah. Everything we read in that entire story is two people explicitly following the Torah. So then to add into the story some kind of ungodliness that's not in the story is a violation of the actual text and what we see in the plain text of the story. Each one of them are following the Torah. And your God will be my God. All that stuff is going on. There's absolutely no reason to believe that anything un-Torah happened in a story that's explicitly about following the Torah straight out. Yes, ma'am.
So to take that story of Ruth and Boaz to a spiritual level, if a woman is divorced after entering Messiah because her husband spiritually dies, but just taking everything to the spiritual level, spiritual seed, raising spiritual children, can you see that? Can you put that?
I'm not understanding your...
Can you apply those principles with the raising up seed? Can you apply those spiritually?
Well, I mean, there's spiritual application for every physical event. I'm just not sure what spiritual application you're trying to make.
I'm saying, if a woman in faith, her husband dies,
Yes.
because death is now spiritual, not physical, in the New Testament.
Well, if you're asking about her freedom to get remarried again, the scripture says if the unbeliever departs, let him depart because he's no longer under. So if that's what you're asking, then
I'm saying if you can take the spiritual application of the brother marrying the woman's.
I'm not understanding how that would be spiritual. If you can explain what you mean by that.
Raising up spiritual children as children, not being just physical but spiritual children. Like,
I'm sorry. I'm not understanding the concept. Are you talking about the two people working together to share the gospel and do things? Or are you talking about two people actually having children?
I don't think I can explain it. I can't get it out.
Okay. Well, we can talk about that later and try to... Because I'm trying to understand what you mean by having spiritual children. To me, having spiritual children is sharing the gospel with somebody and somebody becoming born again. We can do that with anybody. So we don't need to have a marriage to bring forth, because then we're the bride, he's the groom, and we bring forth that way.
Boaz is the groom, so technically you can just apply that to our walk.
Right. Aaron?
There's a section in the Torah that talks about if a man suspects that he marries a woman, if he suspects that there was some unfaithfulness in her, I guess some unfaithfulness that he didn't know about, that they would actually check the marriage bed sheets to confirm that
That's...
there. So my question about that is, does that imply that people can do anything in relationship short of sexual intercourse prior to marriage?
No.
Because, I mean, I'm not saying it does, but...
No, I don't know if there's any children watching this online. But using terms that I hope you will understand without talking in terms that would be unfit for small ears. A man enters covenant at birth, 8 days when there's a circumcision, the Brit Milah takes place. When the man and the woman first join together, there is also a cutting and a breaking. There's the connection, the covenant to become one flesh that takes place at that time. And that brings forth blood. And that's what that deals with is did they violate that covenant? Was there a covenant already made between somebody else and her? It's a whole different story from just did they fool around or whatever. That would be against Torah completely. But this deals with a eternal covenant that God made through that connection and what takes place in the marriage bed. So that's why, and there's the checking of the sheets, which is still done in the Orthodox community.
And I would add that, as I said before, that it is not acceptable to be physically intimate in any regard, really, before marriage, because basically you are, when you are doing things with someone who is not married to you, you are essentially doing those things with someone's future spouse. And if you end up not getting married to that person, you are doing those things with someone else's future spouse. And so I always now say that it is the best practice, and I think completely in line with Torah, to not do anything with someone that you would not do with someone else's wife that's already married.
And we are close to out of time for the evening, so if this is a short question.
Yeah, it is. So what about things that would be considered just very mildly innocent contact, holding hands, hugging, that
I can tell you my answer to that question is the parents set the standard for their children. So I leave that in the hands. That's why there's fathers and mothers involved. The parents set the standard for, do you hold hands? Can you side hug? Can you do this? That's something the parents determine. But again, best practices.
Right.
If the first person you ever kiss is on your wedding day, that's the best kiss you'll ever have. There's never comparing that person to anybody else. If the first time you have intimate relations is with your wife, that's the best there is, because there's no comparison. You're not ever going to be, well, this wasn't as good as that one, or this wasn't as... None of that comes into the picture. So there's reasons for this beyond just chastity, but it makes for an unbreakable bond, because the best there is what you have, and it's never compared to anything else. And with that, we're going to close for the evening.
Would just like to add one thing, and that is that aside of those standards being handed down by the authorities over you, I think it's important to remember that we're not just talking about physical intimacy, we're talking about emotional intimacy. And if in your culture, because we have a wide variety of cultures in this nation even, if in your culture holding hands leads to emotional intimacy, that's probably something that you should limit or avoid. And if holding hands does not lead to emotional intimacy, then that's perfectly fine.
Right. If you're a Eskimo, and I don't even know if that's a PC term anymore, probably not, but if you are, then, they kissed, they're very intimate by rubbing noses together, where for most Americans that wouldn't be that intimate. So it depends on the culture, as you said, at what things. And listen, there's one more thing I want to say in closing, and that is, if your parents are not godly, don't let them set the... there's a point at which you have to say, I'm going to do what's godly regardless. But if your parents are godly, then let them be the lead in what happens. But if they're ungodly, if your parents are like, I don't care if you do whatever, that's not the standard to be set.
Or whoever is chosen.
Right, or whoever is chosen for that position. Thank you all so much was that the wrong sign? Thank you so much for tuning in.